Hello everyone, so today we're going to be going through all the manga I read throughout January and February. I was going to do my January manga reads video as I usually do, and then things just kind of got away from me, so I never did it. And so I plan to just skip it and move on to February, but in February I read like nothing. So I figured I'll just put them both together in this video. But before we get into my actual thoughts and opinions and feelings about everything that I read, I want to show you some stats from my spreadsheet. I think it will be very interesting to compare my reading month of January to my reading month of February and see how things differed. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, so here's my spreadsheet. You've seen it before probably if you've seen my videos before, but I just want to look at a couple of the stats, mainly the monthly stats, but I do want to start here on the main page. I just want to show you my books owned versus books read here. And you can see my total is 1660, which has been lowered from some unhauling. But then I have 222 unread manga right now, and my percent read is 86.63%. So we can see some genres here as well, but I really want to look at the monthly stats. But first, we can see things happened. So in January, you can see I read almost 60 volumes, mostly volumes, some books. And then February, it's down to 17. So February was an abysmal reading month, both in terms of quantity and quality. So let's go ahead and look at my monthly stats. So we will start in January, obviously. Here it is. So I read 58 books. My pages read were 14,000, a little bit over. I did 28 rereads. Most of those were Golden Kamuy. And I acquired 22 books and library checkouts. I don't really keep updated, so ignore that. I also listened to some audiobooks, but let's look at the genres. Actually, before that, let's look at the ratings. So as you can see, my most typical rating was a 4-star, which is very, very normal for me. I give lots of 4 stars. There were 3 5-stars. Spoilers, those were all Golden Kamuy. So these are my ratings. As you can see, I give lots of 4 stars. So that all makes sense. Let's look at the genres over here. So this is kind of hard to look at because of the colors on this graph. So let's just look at the table here. So the most read genre for sure was historical. That's because I categorize Golden Kamuy as historical. I feel like if there was an action genre on this graph, then that would be what I categorize it as. But for the genres I have, it was historical. Nothing really was anywhere close. Surprisingly, the second most read was a tie between romance and contemporary / slice of life, which is very funny if you know anything about my reading tastes. Also, average rating was 3.8. That is actually a little bit above average, or above average for me anyway. So then let's go into format. Obviously, mostly manga, but I did read 3 novels in January, which is good because my goal is to read 2 every month. Let's go down a little bit to publishers. No surprise, I read all of Golden Kamuy, so Viz was going to be heavily represented here. If we care about the shortest and longest book I read, the shortest book was Touring After the Apocalypse, Volume 4, and the longest one was Innocent, Volume 1. And let's go down here to the demographics. So, no surprise, Seinen at number 1 with 39 volumes read. Next was Shonen. Shoujo was 4 volumes, and I read 1 josei manga. So yeah, that was January. Honestly, this is a pretty typical reading month for me, maybe a little bit high, but I always try to start out the year doing very well. But then February, it just all went to disaster. So let's take a look. So we can see here, my books read 17 books, and I'm gonna spoil it. There were 4 novels in there. I'm about to finish one more, so it'll be 18, but there was no manga reading happening in February, really. My pages read were a little under 4,000, which is the worst reading month I've had in probably 3 years. 5 rereads, 19 and a half hours of audiobooks listened. Even though I read more books this month, somehow the number of hours I listened to them went down. I don't know. I guess I read shorter books. But here we can see where the trouble is with my ratings. As I just mentioned, I give lots of 4 stars. That's my usual rating. In February, you can see it's mostly 3 stars. I did have 2 5-stars, and they were both ones that I have not read before. One was a manga, one was a book. I will talk about the manga later. So if we don't count Golden Kamuy, the first 5-star read in the year I had was in February, and it was a manga. What about my genres? Mostly fantasy here. I have really been wanting to read a lot of fantasy lately. Novels, though, not really manga. And the other ones are all scattered about. There's not really enough books to have this look nice like January. As you can see, 13 manga, 4 novels, 13 volumes of manga. That's not good. For me anyway. Let's go down. I did read 3 indie manga this month. That's pretty cool. The shortest book I read was Ripples, which I'm not going to talk about in this video. I just don't have enough thoughts about it to share. But the longest book I read was a novel, and that was Silver Under Nightfall, which was my other 5-star read for February. Demographics, 7 shoujo. That's Children of the Whales, I guess, and then one other thing that I can't think of at the moment. But having a month be mostly shoujo is kind of crazy. If you're wondering, when I have books, I just don't list anything for the demographics since I am just tracking demographics and I don't really care about whether a book is middle grade, young adult, or adult. I just track the manga. 7 shoujo, 2 josei, 1 seinen, and 0 shonen. That is a weird reading month. But yeah, that's all I wanted to talk about in this section. I just wanted to show you the comparison between how great of a reading month January was and how terrible February was. Hopefully March is better. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into my actual thoughts and opinions about the manga I read throughout the last 2 months. So firstly, I read all of Orange. Now this was my second time reading Orange, at least the complete collection or the first 2 omnibuses, but I never read Orange Future and Orange to You Dear One, which you can see here. So I read the entire series in January. This was on my list of series I need to read in 2024, so that was an easy one to check off the list. I do believe I enjoyed reading it more this time than the first time. The first time I was really disinterested because of the romance part, but this time, because I was expecting that, I was able to not really focus on it as much, but more just appreciate the friendship between these 6 characters. I just really appreciate how supportive of each other they are, and they definitely make mistakes and mess things up throughout their friendship journey, but they are able to get past that and work together to save their friend. While I was reading this though, I did feel like there's just something missing here and I can't pinpoint it. Maybe I just wanted it to be a little bit longer so we can explore each of these characters more in depth. There isn't a lot of time for that with this plot, mainly focusing on this character here. I guess I never said the synopsis. I feel like I assumed most people know the synopsis of the series, but I guess I shouldn't assume that. Basically, this is about a group of friends, and one day the main character, girl, she receives a letter from seemingly herself in the future that says to befriend this guy right here and get to know him and hopefully save him from dying in the future. So obviously there's a little bit of a sci-fi element there, and honestly I wish that they had just kind of swept past that and not tried to explain it, because the explanation didn't feel like it was necessary. It kind of felt like the editor went, okay, we need an explanation for this sci-fi element, so the author just threw in something because it felt like they needed something, but I don't feel like they did need the explanation. I just didn't feel like it was integrated very well into the story. And obviously that's not the main purpose of this story. It's something very different, but that's just something that bothered me a little bit. So now I sound like I'm nitpicking, but I did end up enjoying this more the second time reading it. However, I still don't think I liked it enough to buy the box set, which then brings up the question, if I didn't like it enough to buy the box set because I don't think I'm going to reread it, does that mean I need to then unhaul the series again? Which I guess is the case. So I guess this is going back on the unhaul pile. This is a very weird situation because I have unhauled this before, again, when I read the original series, and then the 2 new volumes came out and I wanted to read those. So I bought the entire series again, and now I'm at the point where I've read it again and I'm going to unhaul it again. But overall, this series is good, I would say. I would probably give it a 7, 6.5, 7 out of 10, but probably not one I'm going to return to. The next series I read was Anti-Romance. There are 2 volumes of this. I read both of them. This is about 2 guys who are childhood friends. They are now adults and they live together and they kind of have feelings for each other, but they don't want to confront those feelings, so they kind of just pretend that they don't have those feelings. But then there's also this like strenuous friendship between them because they are hiding these feelings, and it's a little bit complicated and messy. So my problem with this manga is entirely the execution. I felt like the author or the characters were constantly saying how good of friends these 2 characters were, but they never acted like friends in the manga at all. They didn't spend any time together. In fact, it mostly felt like they were avoiding each other, especially in the first volume. I felt like they just didn't want to be near each other at all, so it was very difficult for me to believe the friendship or the feelings they have for each other. They do seem to know a lot about each other, but that's very impressive considering they don't spend any time together, they don't talk to each other. It's very awkward. So when I can't even believe the friendship between two childhood friends, there's just no way I'm going to believe the romance between them either. There's also a conflict with one of these guys, the blonde one. He is basically feeling like he's forced to take over his mother's hairstylist profession because she has some health issues or something like that. And while that is an interesting enough conflict, there is a terrible, terrible resolution to that. Not like something terrible happens, but the way that it is resolved is very silly in my opinion. It basically is just like, oh, well, that didn't matter at all, and you basically just wasted your life for nothing. So I don't know, this was only 2 volumes, so maybe if it was more than that, it would have been a little bit better, but definitely did not enjoy this reading experience at all. All right, now moving on to something much better. Next, I read all 3 volumes of Soloist in a Cage. This is a dystopian manga focusing on the city that's basically entirely made up of criminals. It's a prison city, and then the families of the criminals and their descendants. And so it started with a bunch of criminals, but now it's just regular people living in this really dystopian city that they seemingly can never escape. So we follow this character here. Her name is Chloe. In the beginning of the manga, she and her baby brother live in an apartment together. Their parents have disappeared. They have seemingly been abandoned by them, and through various circumstances, the 2 siblings get separated. Now, in our current storyline, Chloe is trying to find her brother, and she is determined to do absolutely anything she has to reunite with her brother, even if that includes becoming a monster. So this was definitely a lot darker than I was expecting it to be. I don't know why, considering it's literally a prison city. But there were lots of gangs and cults that seemed to be entirely focused on just harming children, which is a little bit difficult to read. I also feel like maybe because it's only 3 volumes, the world building is a little bit lacking. You have this interesting city, but we don't learn any of the history of it. We don't really see how it's organized or how the government uses it, just that it's filled with criminals and their families. So as per usual, I started with the critiques. Now let's get into the things I really liked about this. I really appreciate seeing Chloe's changing mental state as she does some increasingly terrible things to try to find her brother. You can definitely see that she is haunted by the things she's done, sometimes quite literally. And the art style changes a bit during some of these scenes where she's confronted with the things that she's done, and that definitely made them hit even closer to home. It made it a lot more emotional. There's also, if you couldn't tell from the cover, quite a bit of dancing throughout this manga, and I thought that was used in a very interesting way. I feel like there could be some spoilers there, so that's all I'm going to say. Now, I will say, the ratings for these 3 volumes, at least the ones that I've seen on Goodreads, are very, very high. Especially for a short 3-volume series. I was a little bit surprised by them. I don't think it's quite that good, at least in my opinion. It wasn't quite that high, but I did think it was a good, short, action, dystopian, psychological series to read in one night. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, this is one I can recommend as a pretty good series. Okay, now let's move on from a pretty good series to an absolutely amazing, one of my favorite series ever, Golden Kamuy. So in January, I read through all 31 volumes. Volumes 1 through 26 were rereads, and then volumes 27 through 31 were new to me. I didn't know anything. I hadn't seen any spoilers. I knew some opinions about the ending, but that's the same opinion I see for every ending of every manga ever, so it didn't really matter. So what can I say about Golden Kamuy that I haven't already said before? I'm not sure. If you don't know what this is about, basically, our main character Sugimoto here, he was a soldier in the Japanese and Russian War. Now he is finished with that, and he is trying to find this mysterious Ainu gold because he wants to help a woman that he knew, actually the wife of one of his best friends who died during the war. In order to do that, he teams up with an Ainu girl named Asurpa and some other groups of people, some of whom are more sane than others, but they basically go on this huge journey to find the treasure and solve the mystery behind it. So I love Golden Kamuy. I don't think Golden Kamuy is for everyone, but I will say my favorite things about it. 1, it's hilarious. I don't care if the humor is kind of immature. I think it's very funny. Number 2, the art, especially the art of the animals. So the characters are drawn in this more stylized version, but when there's any animal, it's incredibly realistic and very highly detailed. So they definitely stand out as both like food sources, danger sources, stuff like that. I don't really know if that's making sense, but because this manga is so focused on Ainu culture, they talk a lot about animals and their uses and their importance. So to have the animals drawn like that really kind of reflects the cultural importance of these beings. And I touched on this already, but the Ainu culture in here is very interesting to learn about. I don't think I've ever seen another manga that even attempts to discuss Ainu culture, let alone definitely one that explores it as deeply as this one does. So I love those three things, and of course, the characters. There are so many characters in here. They're all just crazy, super memorable. I love the antagonist especially. I do believe the first time I read this series, I liked the antagonist, but he wasn't my favorite. I'm thinking of Surumi, of course. I really enjoyed his character the first time I read it, but this time, he's one of my new favorite antagonists of all time. Just completely insane, kind of literally. You really never know what he's going to do next. And the more we learn about his backstory, the more interesting the entire story becomes. And throughout the story, of course, there are a bunch of different groups of people trying to find the Ainu gold. So sometimes they'll work together, sometimes they're enemies, and it's all just great fun. So I could go on about this for a long time, but I'll probably stop there. The one last thing I will say is that I liked the ending. I thought it was satisfying. The last few volumes were so action-packed, I was just flipping through them so quickly to see what was going to happen at the end. But overall, I thought the ending was great. I love this manga. It's definitely my top 20. I don't really have my whole top 10, top 20 thought out. It could be top 10. I'm not sure. Again, I don't think that way really. But I'm really happy that it was finished in January and that I was able to read through the entire series at once because I definitely had a lot of fun with it. Okay, that was everything I read in January. And you saw at the beginning, my reading for February was just terrible. But I did have 2 5-stars. One of those was a manga, so I'll talk about that now. And I didn't know what to expect from this manga. I just knew that it was a horror manga. It had generally good reviews, but reviews for horror, manga, books, anything are very hit or miss because it's such a subjective genre, so I didn't really know what I was getting into. I did also know that the author was pretty famous in the realm of horror, so I was excited to read it. And the manga I'm talking about is Panorama of Hell. This is put out by Starfruit Books. It is a one-shot by Hideshi Hino. So how do I describe this? This is gory. This is a horror manga. It's gross. It's gruesome. It's about a painter. And this painter really loves the color blood. And so in this story, he is talking directly to us. And he is talking all about these paintings that he has done in blood. And at first you're going, okay, this guy's really weird. And then he starts talking about his family and you're like, okay, that's why he's really weird. And so he goes on, telling these stories about his family and about his love of blood. And it's kind of funny. It's a little bit funny at the beginning, kind of like this black humor. But then there's this kind of tone shift and things get kind of sad. And we really see this character just completely lose it. And I don't want to say anything else really because I'm afraid I'm going to give too much away, but I just completely loved this. The way that the main character breaks the fourth wall, it talks directly to the reader, gets pretty intense, and it also has a pretty significant connection to war. The main character has obviously been affected by war and the cycles of abuse, and this is definitely plaguing his mind. This manga has very striking imagery, as you could probably tell from the cover, and the ending was amazing. So hopefully I'm not overhyping this manga. I hate doing that, but I just loved everything about this. And again, horror manga and just the horror genre in general is incredibly subjective. It's very hard to recommend horror things, but I completely love this one. I really do now want to try out more Hideshi Hino works. I have not read any of them before. I'm not sure any of them would impact me as much as this one did, but I'm so happy I went ahead and bought this copy. This is from a smaller publisher, so if you're looking to pick this up, I would definitely do so sooner rather than later. I don't know how many they've printed or how many they're planning on printing, but this was definitely my favorite manga of February and the only thing that was saving me from pretty much abysmal manga reading in the month, so very happy I picked this one up. The other two big things on my TBR for February were I Cannot Reach You, volumes 1 through 6, which I read one volume of and I dropped because I didn't care about it. And the other one, which was the main thing I was supposed to be reading in February, was Children of the Whales. So previously I have read volumes 1 through 5. and I enjoyed it at the time, which is obviously why I have been buying the volumes as they've come out since 2018 when Volume 5 came out. And I was just waiting for the series to end, and now the series has ended. So I started my read again, and I read Volumes 1 through 5, and I also read Volume 6. I struggled through Volume 6. And I don't know what I was thinking the first time because I did not enjoy this at all this time. I guess I'll give a brief synopsis. This is about a group of people who live on this thing called the mud whale. At least when I was reading it, I don't think it's actually a whale, but that's part of the mystery. Some of these people have special powers which make them live very short lives, but they don't really know about the outside world. They don't know why they live on this whale until one day a mysterious outsider girl ends up meeting them and kind of opens their world up to everything outside of it. And the way this is told is from this perspective of this kid. I think he's like 14. He's basically an archivist. So he's telling us the story through kind of like journals, as much as you can portray that in manga. And unfortunately, that storytelling aspect kind of completely ruined this for me. Kind of funny how Panorama of Hell definitely has the character talking directly to us, but for some reason in here, where we are reading this guy's journal, and there's just so many panels of him speaking directly to the reader. I don't know why I didn't like it here. Maybe it's just the different genres, because this is definitely more fantasy. I don't know. But also, I guess related to that, there is some kind of vocabulary in here. And I guess I have to give a brief introduction of some of the magic system. So there are these characters who basically are repressing their emotions because they feel like letting out their emotions makes them weak. So they kind of repress their emotions. They actually put their emotions into this weird thing so they don't feel emotions. And for some reason, they are named the Apatheia, which means like apathy, right? Which of course makes sense. In fact, I feel like it's too on point. But then once I noticed that naming scheme, I kind of noticed the naming scheme for all the things, and they're all like that. There's this thing called the Reign of Catharta, and that's when all the emotions are let out, like catharsis. And then you have this event called Cataclysmos, like cataclysm, except there's lots of K's and Y's to make it fantasy. And I don't know why this bothered me so much, but it really did. And once I started noticing it, it was just all over the place. So it felt like a lot of these terms were not creative, but also trying too hard to be too fantasy. They just used the Latin name and added lots of K's and Y's and I don't know. Tried to make it sound cool, but in my opinion, it didn't sound cool. And that doesn't matter for the story. It doesn't matter. I don't think this would bother many people, but for some reason it really bothered me. And I will mention, of course, the art in here is beautiful. The landscapes are amazing to look at. It's so highly detailed. However, when there are action scenes, which are quite a few, when the characters use their magic, it just adds like too much. There's too much to look at. They get like these markings all over their skin and also in the air, and it's just really like busy. And unfortunately, the characters were just not that interesting to me. There are several times where they introduce a character, and I know as soon as they introduce that character, they are only introducing them to later kill them off to make an emotional moment for one of the main group of characters. And so yeah, once we got into learning a little bit more about the mud whale and these people and their conflicts, then I just suddenly lost interest, which is really annoying considering how long I was collecting this. And I could, of course, go ahead and continue reading, but at this point, I'm trying to stop doing that and stop being a completionist and just drop things when I've decided I'm not enjoying them anymore. So yeah, I don't know what happened in the past 5 to 6 years since I last read this, because I did enjoy it at one time, but I don't know, maybe I didn't notice those weird naming schemes last time. But I do know that more people enjoy this than I do, which is fantastic. I really did want to love this, but unfortunately I did not. And so after I decided to stop reading that, I very quickly realized that I didn't want to be reading any manga, really. So I just had one more thing on my TBR. I started reading a lot of novels, which I won't talk about here, but I wasn't enjoying those too much either. But the last thing I read in February was Pandora. This is a group of short stories focusing on the theme of grief. In the note at the end, the author mentions that this was inspired by COVID, but you did not need that author's note to realize this. It was very obvious. Just the emotional turmoil and loss that happened during the pandemic is very clear in this manga. It explores feeling isolated and lost after something happens to you or someone you love and you don't really know how to cope or deal with that and you're really struggling, but it also makes it clear. It's called Pandora, so it wants you to know that there's still a little bit of hope out there. I do want to mention that this is entirely in watercolor, which is very nice to look at, but it did make it a little bit difficult to follow sometimes. I am not artistic in any way, but I am very impressed by the use of watercolor and how kind of detailed you can get with that medium. Again, I don't know anything about painting or art or anything, I guess, but I did really appreciate this manga and the message it was trying to portray. So yeah, that was everything I wanted to talk about in this video. These are most of the things I've read in January and February, ignoring a couple volumes here and there that I didn't have enough thoughts to share with you. I did also read quite a few novels, which I'm not going to talk about here. Maybe I'll put up on Instagram if people want to see my thoughts on those. But I don't know. Lots of those I had some mixed feelings about anyway, so we'll see. But that's going to be it for this video. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!